When I left, I wanted to take all those clients with me. I wanted them to continue to ring me, even though I was now going to have to charge for them. And don't worry, there were plenty of naysayers in my family and in my circle of people that said they like you because you're free. They're not going to pay you.
So I Heard, a podcast for cattle vets, students and anyone interested in the dairy and beef industries. It's been brought to you by the Australian Cattle Vets, a special interest group of the Australian Veterinary Association. I'm agricultural journalist Prue Adams. Hello again. You're going to love hearing how Dr. Gillian Kelly ignored the naysayers, ditched in her secure government job and went out on her own as a consultant. Not any old consultant though, but one with a subscription-based approach to monetising her expertise. She also puts out paid newsletters, embraces social media and has an artistic side hustle, which many of you will know her through. She's the well-followed Miss Vet on Instagram. Jill Kelly, did you always want to be a cattle vet?
God, no. When I was really little, wanted to be a hairdresser, like my Auntie Wendy, because I've always liked dressing up and pretty things and all those sorts of things. Love the Barbie dolls. And I thought that something like that might be my calling. But as I got further and further into high school, I enjoyed stories. I like storytelling. And so I thought I might have been a rural journalist at one point. And silly me, when I went to boarding school in Year 9, I thought, well, you can't be a journalist if you can't type, so I better do computer studies, which in the mid-90s wasn't that exciting. And then my friend and I, that was also in computer studies, heard that the boys that did ag were cuter than the boys that did computer studies. And so we switched into ag, and I just loved it and ended up showing cattle and all those sorts of things. And I think that with a very great ag teacher called Doc Cleaver directed me down a path into agriculture and eventually becoming a cattle vet.
What a path. And were the boys cuter?
Yeah, they were, absolutely.
Good decision then. So when you did your veterinary degree, what was the path from there, in terms of how you decided that it was going to be cattle in particular that you were going to specialise in?
Well, it was a convoluted path. I didn't actually get the marks to get into vet either. Back in those days, you needed 98.4 to get in, and I got 97.2. So I managed to get an interview at Sydney Uni and sort of beg for a position, and they eventually let me in. I deferred for a year and worked back in Coonamble and then went to uni the year later. Living in Sydney really wasn't for me. I was a bit of a fish out of water. So as soon as I graduated, I got a mixed practice job at Roma in southwest Queensland, and it was the best clinic and the best job. And it was a heavily dominated cattle practice. Lots of responsibility given to the vets. So we would often go and do pre-testing jobs and camp on farm and, do a few days' work all in a row, run a branch clinic, do a heap of horse work. And so your skill level developed really quickly. And we had a great clientele as well that were very accepting of new grads and very willing to give you a go on their farm. And that was the best 2 years to start me off in clinical cattle practice.
So what led you to having your own consultancy?
So I did a couple of years at Roma, and then I went overseas and did the obligatory locum stint in the UK and came back, locumed and worked in a few different other clinics in Australia, and I wasn't in love with clinical practice anymore. I didn't like the pace. I was sick of going out and, say, pulling a calf and thinking to myself, the reason that calf stuck is because of nutrition or management on this farm, and I could help with that, but I've never got the time. There's always someone waiting back at the clinic. I want to do more of this, and I was pretty disillusioned with it all. I remember stomach tubing a colicky horse at midnight on New Year's Eve and watching the fireworks go off over Dubbo and thinking, I'm in my mid-20s and I'm at work all the time. This sucks. I really hate it. At that point, I took a government job with it was the LHPA in those days. And that was really a stopgap measure. I was actually considering going back to uni and doing a dip ed and becoming an ag teacher. And I really loved the government job, and I stayed there 11 years. And that gave me a lot of new skills. And then 3 years ago, I chose to leave the government job and I launched AHN Consulting, which stands for Animal Health and Nutrition Consulting. And I now run a consultancy practice which services sheep and cattle and some rangeland goat clients with a heavy focus on farm management and livestock productivity and nutrition.
When you had the government job, did you have a plan in place for the next step in terms of going out on your own as a consultant, or did it happen organically?
Yeah, it happened organically. So I got into the job, and back when I started, it was LHPA. So it had its own separate constitution, and it was ratepayer funded, and we got a lot of leeway. So I was told just to service my ratepayers, just provide them with service. And so we did pestivirus workshops, and we did lepto research projects, and I live in an area where we have a very variable rainfall pattern, and we go into big droughts. So I did a lot of feeding and nutrition sort of stuff, which was fly by the seat of my pants to start with. And then I went back to uni and did a CVE course in ruminant nutrition and sat my memberships in that and specialised in that in a way. So that's come in very handy, because that was really, I found my passion. I think veterinary science actually isn't my passion. I think ruminant nutrition and farm productivity is. So that's been the bedstone of the new business. It's not new anymore. It's 3 years old, but still feels new. It was never the plan. The plan was just always to have a nice life, and I wanted to buy more land of my own, and I have a couple of side hustles. So I like a varied workload, I like a varied income stream, and I like just having a nice life. It doesn't have to be too veterinary or work focused for me. I was quite happy at that point to coast along, have a good time at LHPA, and I didn't actually quite kind of realise the skills that I was developing. As it wore on and as 11 years kind of passed, I realised that I'd built a lot of equity in myself. I'd built a name for myself, I'd built a reputation, I'd built a lot of skills. And there was a change of system, and the job became more restrictive, and there were rules and there were restrictions on the service I could deliver. And I realised very soon that I'd actually built more capital than I could extract from that job, and I was probably more valuable as an asset on my own than I was in that job, so I chose to leave. And I think it had always been percolating in the back of my mind. So I rang my accountant one week and said, I'm going to buy another property, like a block of land. Can we do some sums on how that's going to look? And she was like, yep, that's fine. And then I rang her the following week. I was like, scratch that. I'm leaving my job. Can you set me up as a company? And she's like, whoa, right, we've changed tack. But that's what I did. And so I wrote a resignation letter and thought I might just not hand this in yet. And I drew a logo. I got my accountant to set me up a company. And then I sat down and scratched out a rough business model of what it might look like. And I was well aware that I was taking quite a big risk, because I've lost a lot of my clinical skills because I'd been out of clinical practice for 11 years, and I could see no one around me running a business like I envisaged. So I wasn't really sure who to follow or what to do necessarily, but I just watched other businesses that were completely unrelated to veterinary science. For example, there's a wonderful writer who's also become a friend, who her daughter is a vet. She'll know who I'm talking about. But she writes a beautiful newsletter called The Sit Spot, and she charges for that. And I thought, if I'm paying a writer to send me a little snippet of her life every week, why can't my clients pay me to deliver them veterinary science and animal nutrition in a newsletter every fortnight? And that is actually stuff that might just save their stock. Like, it's really valuable information. And so I very quickly, as I set the business model up, I knew that all I had to sell was my time, and that was quite limited, because you can only charge so much an hour, and there's only so many hours in every working week. And so I had to work out other ways of generating income. But I also was just very proud and protective of the skills and the equity that I'd built, and I wanted people to pay for that. I wasn't giving it away for free. And so we have tiers of membership. You can sign up for the newsletter, the paid newsletter. We have a client WhatsApp group that's got 160 clients in it. We run a major event every year and some other minor events throughout the year. We offer tiers of service in terms of phone consultations and on-farm consultations. And we also hire out Optiways, and we sell merchandise and animal health products. We do our best to deliver a high level of service and veterinary science. We've got a business plan that we stick to quite rigidly, or not rigidly, but we have it in mind with every decision that we make. And it's working. So I'm pretty proud of what we've built, but it is very different to a typical clinical vet practice.
What a path. And it seems to me as if you had to develop what you're doing pretty much from scratch, even though you did look around. Have you seen anything similar since actually starting your own consultancy?
I mean, there's lots of other veterinary consultants out there, but they're typically men. They're typically older. They're at a different stage of their career path. They don't necessarily have a website, or it's not broadcast as to what they actually do or actually deliver or how they generate income or what services they deliver. It's sort of a word of mouth, and they've got like a client base. Whereas we've got a website, we've got a Facebook page, we openly advertise what we do and what we deliver and those sorts of things. So I'm not sure, but I do get a lot of inquiry from vets, but also a lot of what I do isn't veterinary science. And the girls that I employ are not vets. They have agribusiness backgrounds. I do get a lot of inquiry of people who want to do this. And there has been some vets transitioned out of traditional vet jobs into some sort of a livestock consultancy way of doing things, and that's a great thing. It's a pretty valuable service to clients as well.
So you say the girls that you employ, is it a fairly female-focused business?
Yeah, not by intention, nothing against the blokes, but I sort of employ people based on personality. I have a good sense of who's right for the business, and that just so happens that the two of the people that work for me are female.
And local, or do you spread further than your region?
Our clients are spread, particularly the ones that we service on farm are located between Dubbo and Roma, so northwest New South Wales and southern Queensland. But we have newsletter subscribers from Western Australia and Victoria and all over Queensland, New South Wales. And we do have a smattering of on-farm clients that are located outside of that area. But that area suits me for my lifestyle, but also just I love the variable climate and the environment type and the people and the type of farming system that runs up there. So, yes, Isabel is local. She works with me in Canamble. And then Gemma came up to Canamble for the job, but then chose to go to university, which I'm very proud of her for doing. And so she still works for us remotely from Wagga.
So who are your clients?
Farmers, mostly family farms or private farms, but also corporates who come to me that want help with a specific thing usually. They might want to lift their land marking percentages. They might want to lift their weaner growth rates. They might have some kink in their farming system that isn't quite working for them, or that used to work and now doesn't work. There is pressure financially within farming businesses with commodity prices, increasing costs, and sluggish land values that have changed the way farms have to operate. And so I guess that's where I come in. And word has just spread that we get results, and so we get recommended a lot, and so then the client base grows. And what we tend to do is sit down and look at the feed base and the environment that they're farming in when they grow the best feed, or when they grow any feed, and whether or not that suits the class of livestock. So whether their farming system matches their feed base is usually the place we start. And then we look for gaps and excesses. We look at their stocking rate, whether or not they're optimising how they're doing things. We generally look at their animal health program. Often we pull things out of their animal health program rather than add more in. And invariably, these farms, because they are located in variable farming environments, we tend to find that no matter how well you plan things and no matter how well you set things up, there will be times when it just stops raining unexpectedly and we end up with feed gaps. And so we put in place measures to offset that and to continue production through those gaps, which usually, not always, but usually involves confinement feeding. But we try and plug the gaps through either improvement of pastures, fertiliser, growing things, making use of crops, those sorts of things. We do a lot of rations and a lot of supplementary feeding on farms and a lot of creating rations for people just to plug a gap to meet a market target or to finish calving or finish lambing or get to weaning or whatever the case may be.
In veterinary, there are a lot of conversations that vets have with clients, and not even clients, just with the general public, that are not charged out. So it seems to me as if you've found a way of charging out those conversations along with your expertise, of course. Is that part of where you came from with coming up with a consultancy? Yeah,
so when I left the LLS job, part of my job was to have conversations with farmers all the time. And because, again, where I was located, a lot of that was around nutrition and livestock health and things like that. And so when I left, I wanted to take all those clients with me. I wanted them to continue to ring me, even though I was now going to have to charge for them. And don't worry, there were plenty of naysayers in my family and in my circle of people that said they like you because you're free, they're not going to pay you. But I knew the scale of these farming businesses and how many dollars were involved, and I thought my few dollars don't actually matter in the scheme of things, especially not if I add value. And sure, there will be people who see it as a cost, not an investment. And they're probably the clients I don't want because they're going to balk at every cost and they're not going to be capable of growth. So I'm happy to drop them off. But what I did when I left was I offered a relatively cheap entry price to my business. And that took my regular ringers and people, and I took them because not only did I need the business, but I also just loved being part of their farms, and I understood their farms intimately, and I wanted to continue that relationship. So I offered them a fairly low price point and I took them with me. That's a grandfathered price now. So they pay a low fee yearly and then they get to ring me for short phone calls throughout the year just to say, look, this was my worm egg count. And we also do worm egg counts and parasitology. So sometimes they'll be sending that sample to us, but it's like, what drench should I use? Or what vaccines do I need? Or whatever the case may be. And even though we've undervalued that, like the price that they pay probably doesn't reflect the time that we give them, it allowed me to set up a client base from the very day that I started the business, and it also just rewards their loyalty. But it's also the conversations that probably many vets are having for free, and they're not charging anything for those conversations. So that was my justification.
What's the company growth like? Are you continuing to bring on more clients and expand your services, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I had a little farewell from my old job and I had like a heap of farmers come and say goodbye and have a cup of tea. And one of them at the top of a voice said, I think you're mad and you're going to go broke. And that's rung in my ears every day since then. So I've been really cautious of too much growth too quickly. And I also am aware that this business is largely built on me. Like, people want to talk to me, and that's a failing of the business in terms of its ability to expand and something I've got to deal with. But it's also, I need to recognise that is the strength. So I can't put on 10 other vets and expect the same level of service and the same level of devotion of these clients. So I need to work out how to balance that. And I also just keep coming back to my original thing that's been part of my life the whole way through, is that I just want a nice life. And so I don't think I want to be a human resources manager and manage lots of staff. We're 3 years in now. I either need to start saying no to people or I need to put on more technical experts. So we're probably at that crux point where I need to make that choice. I think there's capacity to grow it to some degree, but whether or not it needs to become the biggest, I don't want to be a manager of 10 me's, because that would take me away from my true love, which is the time on farm with the farmers.
Have you come across that farmer who said that you're going to go broke?
They're not a client. They didn't come on board, not even at that low price point. So they're one of the ones that I'm happy to drop off the bottom.
You did mention earlier that you like to have a nice life, obviously, and that you have a side hustle or a couple of side hustles. What are they?
I started painting pictures in 2015 during one of our droughts. I forget which one's which because they kind of run together. But yeah, I started painting and I started to sell a few paintings in town through the local gift shop, and that sort of grew. So now my painting business is called Miss Vet, and Miss Vet is a bit Instagram famous. So I paint pictures in my spare time, and that's one side hustle, and it's extended into tea towels and T-shirts and all sorts of things. And that's something that I don't get to do as often as I should, and I need to prioritise that a little more, but I do love it. And I also trade cattle. We'll trade anything actually, but usually cattle. I just love that because it makes me a better vet, it makes me a better nutritionist, it makes me a better land manager, and it helps keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening in the stock market. It helps me watch what's happening with growth rates. It helps me understand feed quality and quantity. I'm constantly watching it. I'm constantly feeding the information from our cattle back into my client base.
I'm surprised you've even got time for a side hustle or two side hustles. Do you ever sleep?
Oh, yeah. No, I do. The work-life balance is very important. I don't have children, and also I don't do the after hours. So, my business is, it's business hours. So there is time for those other things, and I just need to consciously make time.
Thank you.
No worries.
This has been So I Heard, a podcast commissioned by the Australian Cattle Vets, a special interest group of the Australian Veterinary Association. Background briefings by Ian McDonald. Editing and post-production by Drew Radford at Pod Talk. Music by Stuart Day. I'm Prue Adams. Thanks for listening.